young transitioners, what effect that will have on their bones, because there's the jury is still out whether it will increase osteoporosis, whether it will, does it stunt growth in certain individuals, and all sorts of other things. I mean, I'm a bone person, so I'm interested in what it does to bones, but I've read like some quite scary stuff from other medical areas, such as, we don't know what it does to, when you stop puberty, we don't know what that does to a person's brain development.
Oh, yeah.
I would definitely be concerned about that if I was a parent.
Yes.
So I think that anthropologists really do need to walk away from the term settled science or the phrase the science is settled, and reopen up the debate about this on the osteological level, but also on the behavioral level and further.
What do you think's causing this? Like, this is a phenomenon, and it's not just in anthropology as we laid out, it's in a lot of things, that has taken hold, I would say, from my seat, looking more over the last decade. I don't think I even need to go too much farther back than that. I'm sure there were little signs and stuff, but it's happened so fast to where we're living in this world that wants to demand an iron line on everything based on usually a complete lack of evidence and just some arbitrary definition. And it is affecting the ability of professionals like yourself to go out and do the work you're quite literally trained to do. Is this a funding problem? Like, the people who are funding things, like, where does this begin in your estimation?
Well, I think that the identity politics, I guess that's what I'll, which I think encompasses all of this, right?
Yes.
So the Native American issue, but also the, citational justice issue to the trans issue. I think it's all identity politics. And it's kind of interesting that when people, when my talk was deplatformed for the Society for American Archaeology, so many special interest groups in anthropology jumped on the bandwagon and wrote their own letter against me. So the Black Trowel Collective, who also wrote a supportive letter about the recent cancellation. So they were in favor of our panel being canceled. The Queer Archaeology Group, and all sorts of other groups like that. I think that this is in large part a postmodern movement, basically, and I wouldn't consider myself really that. I wouldn't consider myself that intellectual, quite honestly. It's like
what are we?
But I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and 2 of my siblings are also in academia, and they talk about things and I literally don't understand them. Okay, so because I'm much more kind of a hands-on, I like anatomy, I like bones, I like, in that sense, and so I hadn't really thought about where things were coming from until more recently. And I would say more recently, like maybe 2018 or so, when I started writing the book. And I think that it's postmodern movement that basically argues that there is no truth, there's no facts, that the only thing what matters is your lived experience and the victim's narrative. And so then what you get is you get an emphasis on the importance of people identifying as victims, and you create victim groups. And so I think that, and then when whatever they say is taken to be, they wouldn't call it truth, but I guess a post-truth truth, or whatever you want to say, right?
They want to cloak it in something else, but they're really they're accomplishing exactly what you just laid out, with the opposite end result, which is that they're saying, as you put it, the only truth is your lived experience, except for when we then tell you that this is the only acceptable lived experience that
Right.
we say you can have.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you disagree, then then you're anti-indigenous, you're a racist, you're a colonialist, a ghoul, or even a bitch. It doesn't matter. But, one of the things I think is interesting is how personal the attacks get.
Oh, yeah.
Not only against me, but against people like Frances Widdowson, who has challenged she's a professor at Mount Royal University who has been fired in part for challenging the residential school clandestine graves story. So I don't know
what?
So basically, the Indian residential schools in Canada, they've been using ground-penetrating radar to find unmarked graves of children. So this would be like starting a couple hundred years ago to up to the 70s or so, right? Or the 60s. And Frances Widdowson is I believe she's an economist, and she talks about the indigenous, Native American, First Nations in Canada, kind of industry that is very similar to here, where they get a lot of government perks to try to help them out of their poverty, and also because of the past, and they're considered as there's sovereignty issues. But basically, there's this big hoax that has been going on in Canada, and it has leaked over into the U.S. a little bit, but not nearly as bad, that the areas where there were Indian residential schools, so basically boarding schools for Native Americans, basically that children died here and they were buried and they are unmarked graves. Now, of course, children died in vast numbers in historic times and prehistoric times. I mean, we know that. I mean, child mortality was very high. Marked graves is something fairly new. So usually, the grave marker is fairly new. Sometimes the graves were marked, like in, let's say, early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s or so, but they were done with wooden crosses that then deteriorated and. But the argument for the main problem with the Indian residential school narrative is that it's clandestine graves. So basically, children were, sometimes the story is that they were murdered and then buried, and or they tried to run away, and they were neglected and died, and so it's kind of like this crime, right? And so some anthropologists have been using ground-penetrating radar to go through these areas to find evidence of graves. Well, ground-penetrating radar will not tell you if there are graves. It will just tell you if something's in the ground. What it is in the ground, you have to dig up to find out what it is, right? You actually have to excavate it. But one of the big sites, the Kamloops site, has like 250 marks that have been designated as graves, but they've never been excavated. But they are treated as graves by the politicians and so forth. So she has exposed some of this scandal, and she and I just recently wrote an article together talking about these kinds of issues and why ground-penetrating radar is only the first step to determine something, not the last step. A tree root can make you think that something's under there,
Sure.
So, and she was fired from her position at Mount Royal University, and the attacks on her are also very personal. So it's another example. I'm she's currently fighting to get her job back, and I wish her all the best. But it is people sometimes say, oh, why don't you go elsewhere like Canada? And I'm like, it's not better. It's worse.
That is, yeah. I mean, it's a shame that people even have to feel like they're taking a stand on something. That's pretty common sense in a lot of cases. Yeah. I mean, we're living in a world where you do have a reaction to everything, though, right? And what I mean by that is I try to live in the middle with things because that's where equilibrium is. And so, for example, if you have academia putting an ivory tower around any loosely defined truth that they decide is real, and then you have people who come in and maybe they're not from academia, but they're smart, and they say, well, wait a minute, we have some evidence that could question that. What happens? The people from the ivory tower shoot spears down at him and tell him to fuck off, and that's the end of it, right? But it's not the end of it. Yeah. Because then these people start to get mad. Yeah. Because they're a human, and they react. And so what happens then? Then they try to build more evidence. And maybe they then build evidence beyond what's actually real evidence, and they start to make the opposite mistake from the other end. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? And so I constantly am seeing across all different fields that you have the experts and the renegades, right? And to me, I'm always looking at pieces of what they say, and sometimes they both say ridiculous shit that I'm like, okay, stop, right? Yeah. But then other times I'm like, okay, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this. But it's almost like the world is set up in a way that we can't live in that combination. Right. They have to hate each other and fight each other.
Yeah, and I do think that that's part, that there is that big problem. And like archaeology, interestingly, has a very long history of armchair archaeologists, and that we've learned a lot from. And
what do you mean we've learned a lot from?
Well, a lot of excavations early on were from armchair archaeologists, and so we have sites from those curational materials that are curated from them. But we've also, a lot of early anthropology and archaeology was done by armchair archaeologists who were, for example, doctors. And so they used their evidence, they used their medical experience to understand past diseases. And we have it's even from those armchair archaeologists, the medical doctors, you get a whole new group field called paleopathology. This pathology disease, old
so it
diseases.
Turned into something okay.
Yeah. And so, and like if you read some of my own work, if you look at my academic literature, I have I would say several different veins of research. And one of those veins is understanding diseases of the past, the bone diseases of the past. And in order to do that, I oftentimes use a comparative approach with medical literature. Well, this is directly a result of those doctors who spent their weekends, being archaeologists. So medical doctors, right? And actually one of the last studies that I did on the Native American remains, the Ryan Mound, was a study on a single individual. So it was like a case study, right? And this individual had a big bump on the back of the head, almost like a golf ball sized bump on the skull. And me and my co-author were trying to figure out what caused this bump. Usually if you're looking at violence and somebody hits you in the head, you'll see an indent, not a bump, right? Even though if you think about cartoons, they show that the rise and the bump, right?
Yeah, that's where my head was going.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that sometimes you will get a bump, even from an injury. So this individual had this golf ball-sized bump on the back of the head, and when we took an X-ray of the skull, and you could see a hairline fracture where there had been a fracture, which was likely where he was hit on the head, and then this caused likely a hematoma, so like a blood clot, and then this ossified and gave the bump.
Whoa.
And we can figure this out by comparing that X-ray to the X-rays in the medical literature. So this is kind of like a marriage of medicine and anthropology. And so with that information, then you can say, well, maybe we're missing a lot of evidence of violence. We know that, for example, when you look at evidence of violence, and prehistoric America was full of violence.
You don't say.
Intertribal violence, and they were constantly replacing each other from one site to another. But you don't find as much evidence you find a lot of evidence, but you don't find as much evidence as there likely is, because you have 4 issues. 1, it could be that the person died without it affecting the bone, right? So arrowhead goes into soft tissue, the person bleeds out, it doesn't leave any mark on the bone. That's one possibility. 2, that it left a mark on the bone, but one that we didn't expect, like the bump on the head. 3, that the person was injured, survived it, and the bone healed enough to make us not see it. And we sometimes do see that. And when we, one way to be able to see that more clearly sometimes is with X-ray evidence. So sometimes a bone will look perfectly fine on the outside, but you can see where it had been broken on the inside. And then 4 is that, sometimes people will have been injured, but we mistake it for injured due to violence, but we mistake it for something else. And vice versa, of course. So we have a pretty good indicator of the level of violence, but we can always get better at determining how much violence there was, just like we can always get better with age estimation and sex determination. And so one of the things is that, this is a moving field, so to speak, that, you can always improve your methods. And some people may say, well, what's the point? These people have been long dead. Why do we want to know what they lived like?
What?
I think that, some people would say that and say, therefore, you should bury the bones. It's not, But I think that in some ways, it tells a human story, which is something that we all...
Yeah.
And the other thing is that it has practical implications, because what we learn in archaeology, we can use in forensics, and vice versa. And so it's not just this kind of esoteric field that, a few people are sitting in in our leather chairs trying to figure out, but rather that it has real world implications. And I also think that by telling the true story of the past, and of course, that story is always open to being reanalyzed and re-examined as long as you still have the data, and the data are the bones. I could be wrong. It could be that there were less violence than thought, right? I think that helps us kind of join, understand each other better. So it's one of the things is like, we have this image, for example, of looting. When you say, the remains were looted, like, I teach a class in mummies, called Mummies, and I spent a year living in Egypt. And when you talk about, many of the mummies, the ancient Egyptian mummies, were destroyed through looting. Most people's immediate thought is those evil Europeans, which there were some who engaged in that, and that was bad. But looting goes back all the way to pharaonic times, and we had like some of the earliest hieroglyphic writing about looting.
Pharaonic?
So the pharaohs, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So it goes back, thousands of years, and there were times when the priests would be moving mummies to try to prevent looting. And that's one of the reasons why it's sometimes difficult to determine whether that mummy is really was that a royal mummy or not? We don't necessarily know because of the movement. So when you reveal that looting is not just by one person or one type of person or one group of people, then you can see, well, you know what? That means that, this kind of bad behavior is something that's a human nature, not a particular group. And therefore, you don't hate a particular group for engaging in that. You figure out, how can we convince all humans not to do that?
Yes.
And I think the way to convince all humans not to do things like that, not to loot, not to destroy remains because they want the financial gain, I think the way to do that is to show them how much we can learn by studying them, and so that when excavation occurs, that it occurs in a way that best preserves the remains, and then curate them so that they can be continuously studied. And this is a human story. So I think it's a real shame when you start pointing fingers and saying, well, it's only these people, because it's never only one person, only one type of people. It's always more complex than that.
Yeah, and I think people always, throughout at least recent history, the last few hundred years especially, they try to create narratives with ancient civilizations and remains that are found to, you can do stuff where it even gets to people trying to claim racial superiority and stuff like that. But in reality, we are an animal. We're the king of the animal kingdom, and as a full human race, there are human sins that we all do throughout time. We are what is it, the 7 deadly sins or whatever. Right. We all have that. It manifests in different ways across everything, but you can get lost in that if you start trying to separate it out, like you said. And I got into this asking you about people who have maybe dissenting opinions, and you used the phrase armchair archaeologist, which I know what you mean, and I've talked to some guys like that as well. But one of the main names now in pop culture is Graham Hancock, because he blew up through going on Joe Rogan so much. He's done a big special now on Netflix that was pretty good, from what I watched. And, he's a very fiery guy, and I think he's a prime example of someone who gets attacked so hard that then he reacts and he kind of comes back at people, right? Yeah. And I understand, I wish he wouldn't do that sometimes, of course.
He has attacked me quite.
Oh, he has?
Yeah.
So you have a personal back. What
I don't know him. But Nick has met him. But basically, on his website, he had an article that was written by his assistant, I guess, that basically said, the academic anthropologists call Graham Hancock a racist, but they're the real racists. And then he goes through or she goes through and basically uses my research and example at the deplatformed talk from the Society for American Archaeology as the example. And so I reached out to him actually very politely, and then I posted I put a comment on to give context, and that was not posted on they did not post my comment. He then later on, I reached out to him and I said, let's talk about this and see where the misunderstanding is, and basically he said that he disagrees with me and he thinks that he stands by that article, and if I want to, I can send him the material that I put on the comment thing, but I didn't bother. And
See, that's very disappointing to me, because that's committing. He's using the same types of attacks that get used against him against you in that way.
Yes.
That's wildly hypocritical.
Yeah. And I don't know his work. From what I understand is he accepts the narrative of the indigenous narratives as evidence, and I don't.
What do you mean by that?
So I think that he takes seriously mythology that they tell as a historical fact, and, which is kind of funny because one of the things that I'm very criticized for is that I don't listen to indigenous narratives. So my position is that origin myths, folklore, oral tradition are all poor lines of evidence because there's no written language, and there hasn't. The Native Americans, First Nations, and most of South Americans, they all did not come up with a written language. And so when they tell us things today, we cannot know how far back that story goes. And so there's fairly good evidence from anthropologists like Lynn Custard, who has spoken about Paleo-Indians, so remember the 7,500 years old and older, and linguistics, because modern Native American tribes have argued that their oral stories, their oral tradition, go back thousands of years. And Glenn Custard, who is a linguist, he said reliably, oral tradition at the very most would go back maybe 500 years, but that would be very generous. And actually more likely 150 or so. So I don't take, like when I hear oral tradition, folklore, I don't take that as serious evidence. I think that, and that's why I come to some of the conclusions that I do, especially regarding the peopling of the Americas and various other aspects. But and Graham Hancock takes that evidence more seriously. Ironically, the people who have called me a racist and sometimes oftentimes criticize me for not taking oral tradition seriously, and so does he. And they both call me racist.
Yeah, see, I personally, that's a tough spot for me when these stories come up. And we've talked with a lot of different people on this podcast. I've had in Matt LaCroix, who's like the ultimate ancient civilizations guy, reading all that stuff, including like the Sumerian tablets and things like that. And then I've had in a Christian apologist, Hugh Ross, who's like the Bible's all real. I've had in physicists like Lawrence Krauss, who tell you none of it's real, right? So we're all over the board here. But human nature says that if 20 of us sat in a circle and whispered a story down the line, just in the same room at the same time in the same part of history, even if it's only 5%, it changes, right?
Yeah.
So no matter what I hear, and all these people disagree with each other, right? But when I hear them talk about ancient stories, I think there could be threads of truth in there.
Right.
But how the hell am I going to figure out which ones there are? So I have to take it all, not to be a cynic, but I have to take it all with a huge grain of salt, because human beings are flawed. They change things. Oral history especially changes. And
that's one of the things that, that I've been very, very much criticized for. And for exactly thinking that way, that, well, the stories will change. And they do. Of course they do. That's why I like the bones, because they are hard evidence, And I mean, my interpretation sometimes could be wrong, but then it's there. And whoever comes next will see that same evidence, and then they can come to conclusions from that evidence. So, I mean, that's the beauty of it. It's like we could have a femur here, a thigh bone here, and we all could look at it and come to different conclusions. And as long as that bone is not buried, it can be studied for decades, and eventually you might get to the right conclusion. But it's not going to change. That bone is a bone.
Yeah.
So I think that's what appeals to me about anatomy and about. And I think the other thing is skeletal anatomy in particular it is the clearest evidence of evolution that you can come across, because there's just so much similarity between one animal and another. And if you were going to design different animals, why would you put all the same bones in the same sequence and just change the shape a little bit? It's remarkable. Like, if you know the skeletal remain, if you know the bones of, a cat, a human, a pig, you'll see so many similarities. And actually, forensic anthropologists oftentimes use pig carcasses to do their experimental studies. Like studies on, like if you take a knife and stab this pig, will it leave a mark on the bone? Yeah.
Why pigs?
Because they don't have fur and they're fatty. So it's just like us. We don't have fur and we're fatty. Some more fatty than others.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like when you're looking at the old bones, though, they had a better lack of a weight problem back then.
I'm sure they did.
As opposed to us now.
And one of the things that I did, one of my areas of research is on arthritis. So degenerative joint disease, right? So, and what we find if you look at patterns of arthritis is in the past, people had arthritis, like if you're looking at hunter-gatherers or, even early agriculturalists in the Americas, you see most of the arthritis is in the upper limb. And in the back, when you have arthritis in the backbones, like the vertebral column, that's almost always just age-related. They got it earlier than we do now, but the shoulder and elbow have much higher rates of arthritis in hunter-gatherer populations in the Americas than we see now in modern populations. But now we have much more knee arthritis and hip arthritis, which is because we're carrying so much weight. It's
wow.
And so
that's painfully obvious.
Yeah. And so like these patterns, you can go from like 3,000 years ago to now, and you can see that really it wasn't until very recently that we got heavier.
Yeah, I always think about, you look at where medicine's gone even in the last 50 years, but go add 100 years to that, go 150 years back. If someone broke a bone and stuff like that, the types of remedies for that are not the same as they have now.
No.
If someone tears a ligament, well, I guess you just have a weak leg for the rest of your life, and we see how easily this stuff happens. So as someone on my end, like I've had severe shoulder problems, right? I've had multiple surgeries on this side. I have to get another one on there. Now I got to get one on this side too. And I'm lucky to be able to have that resource because each time I've done it, it gets fixed very well. And then my dumb ass finds a way to hurt it again. Yeah. But then I'm thinking about all the time, all these, like go back to the hunter-gatherers, as you just said. And you say they're getting arthritis in their elbows and shoulders because these people are climbing trees and shit.
They're throwing things.
They're throwing. Imagine if you're a hunter-gatherer back then at age 15, you just tear your labrum.
Yeah.
Now your shoulder's loose for the rest of your life. You can't climb stuff anymore. Yeah. You're biologically indominant compared to the other people around you. You're not as valuable to your tribe because you can't hunt as effectively. Yeah.
But in the
simple
same
things.
token, what's beautiful about it is that we have, dating back to even Neanderthals, evidence that people who were injured were taken care of. And so you have evidence of people who have limbs that were withered away, and that takes a long time. So if I now break something and I can't use that, then that bone is not going to remodel, and the bone loss continues, but it doesn't remodel. And so the bone will get narrow, it will get smaller, right? Withers away. And it takes quite a long time for that to happen. So if you see an individual that had that happen, you know that they lived a long time with that injury, and that likely means that they were taken care of.
Wow.
Especially another example is
Because they'd be left for dead otherwise. Yeah.
Another example is that you'll see sometimes people who have lost all their teeth, and the bone in their jaw is even resorbed, or the tooth sockets are closed, right? This will happen if you lose your teeth. But it takes a long time. So if you have an individual who has lost all their teeth and their sockets are closed, then they were taken care of in some way, most likely. And so I think that this is a perfect example of, that humans have been looking after each other as well.
That's very cool.
We don't only fight, we sometimes get along. Right?
Yeah. And so I want to get to the fun stuff with you, because we've been going through obviously a lot of the things you've had to deal with. But when you talk about the research you've done, the stuff we've mostly gone through today has been a lot of, I guess, like North American type things you're looking at. But have you done research a lot around the world as well on ancient civilizations? What would you say the scope is?
I mainly have done research on Native American remains, but I have done a research on Quebec prisoners of war from like the 1700s.
Oh, wow.
The Carthage collection, which is the Byzantine Carthage, so 6th century. And then forensic collections. So the oldest thing I've ever done research on is about 2.5 million year old foot bone of what we call a Homo habilis, which is so if you look at human evolution, when you go from the split from apes, the big ape human split, right? Is
approximately when do you think that was?
About 5 million years. And then you have like the little, what we call the Australopithecines, like the Lucies, right? And then around 2.5 million years, you get your first fossils from the genus Homo, so Homo habilis. And habilis means handy in Latin. And so this is also when we see some of the first stone tools made. And so it was thought, and it's still very... many people still link Homo habilis to the first stone tools 2.4 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago. And so Homo habilis, so there's a fossil that is half of a body called Johnny's child or Johnny's boy, depending, which was discovered in, I'm going to say like maybe early 60s, like maybe 1960 or so, by the famous anthropologist Louis Leakey's son, Jonathan. So it's Johnny's boy. And this remain has a foot that it has a part of leg, part of arm, hand, and a foot. And the foot looks like it has arthritis. And so one of the reasons why this is interesting is because it's actually the fusion patterns of so like when we're growing, we have these things between the long bones, and our toes are included, and our feet bones are included in those long bones, that helps grow in length. So they're called growth plates. And then when you stop growing, those fuse. And if you take an X-ray of these body parts, you sometimes will see what we call an epiphyseal scar, or what we also talk about as ghost lines where growth had occurred. And so one of the big questions was the skeletal remains that were considered Johnny's boy, was that only one individual or more than one individual? And one of the things is that it's pretty clear that some of the remains belong to a child or not an adult. But the foot has arthritis. And so if the foot has arthritis, that was not a child. And so what we did was we looked at the X-rays to see these growth lines. And what we found was that the growth pattern suggests that that what was previously thought to be evidence of youth, of the foot belonging to a young individual, is actually just these ghost lines, these scars of growing, right? And you don't see it on the surface. You have to take X-ray. And so so this suggests that there was actually two individuals. An
Oh.
old individual, and old as in, their personal age at death was old, and a young individual. So this was, quite an interesting study. But the practical purpose of it was that looking at that then can tell you that when you find a foot, for example, at a forensic site, and there's actually quite a few forensic sites where only a foot is found, then if you find a foot at a forensic site and you x-ray it and you see these ghost lines, that's not telling you that that individual was young. And therefore, you should not use it for aging. And because previously they thought, oh, if you have a ghost line, you just recently stopped growing. But
When did they figure out the distinction there? How long ago?
well, that was actually in my own study we did that. So that was like maybe 10 years ago.
Whoa.
So yeah.
Very cool.
So
And why do people only find a foot so often? What's the pattern there?
I think that because feet are in shoes, that the shoe protects it. There's even like these stories about feet washing ashore on Australian beaches, and there's so in forensic cases, I think it's because of the shoe.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But you don't really think about shoes 2.5 million years ago, but I guess.
But this would be forensics. So in the ancient things, you find it's random.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
All right. So there's a distinction.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot. But I mean, does it hit you when you're looking at something that's 2.5 million years old? Is there like a weird feeling that comes over your body, like holy shit?
No, I mean, I just think it's fascinating.
Another day at the office.
I just love the whole field. And one of the reasons why I'm so, in a way, upset or annoyed, maybe is a better term, with these kind of political identity politics movements to change the field in ways that is not based on the science, is that anthropology is such a great field. I don't want to see it go to waste. Just recently, for example, in California, there's been 2 laws signed that has basically said that all teaching collections are, if they have any Native American remains, are now prohibited for use.
What?
That they too will be repatriated. Now, if you know anything about teaching collections in anthropology, you can see that this is going to be a nightmare. And basically, it's going to shut down many teaching labs, because when you have, like, in San Jose State University, we have a teaching collection, and the teaching collection is literally hundreds or thousands of bones, many of them fragments, so that when I teach students how to identify what is a human remain, what is human remains, what's non-human remains, what part of the body that is, and so forth, you don't want to just deal with whole bones, because that's not how you would see them in the field. That's not how you'd see them in forensic cases often. And so these are just a hodgepodge of remains from India, like East Indian remains, when they had a thriving bone trade going on, some from medical schools, and and some from various anthropology sites, some given to us from people who had it in their remains in the family. So there's no way to say what this bone is Native American and this one is not. When you're dealing with skeletal remains which are highly fragmented, which are the ones we use to make sure that people are the best osteologists that we can. And this is just, what they're going to do, I'm pretty sure, is say, okay, we don't know which ones are Native Americans and which ones are not, and therefore let's just repatriate all of them. They're not going to go the other way around, Yeah. And it's just going to be a huge dent in the field. And one of the interesting things is Society for California Archaeology just had put out a letter basically expressing this concern. But they also were like, but that doesn't mean that we're against repatriation. They
got to be on the team.
I don't think they see how one led to another, and that it was inevitable. It was going to happen because once the easy repatriations were done, that were clearly linked to tribes, there were still many collections that could not be linked to tribes and still cannot, and those should be preserved for research. And now those are being attacked, and now the next step is teaching collections. And it's just going to, and of course, as we talked about, x-rays, data, photographs, all of this is going to be off the table. And it's going to be the burial of anthropology.
If it were up to you, though, and you could wave a magic wand and be in charge to fix this problem and give hope to the next generation of anthropologists or people going into similar fields that are having similar problems, what's the main actions you would take? What are the main actions you would take?
I would repeal or have whoever is in charge repeal repatriation laws. I would then open up all the facilities that are holding remains that are still like slotted to be repatriated but are not yet, and open those up for research again. And I would hope that it would be my dream that we can bring people into the fold to understand that there's more important things than burial rituals, that it's important to study the remains in a similar way that we've made people aware of organ donorship. You know, in many places in the world, people wait for organs for so much longer than in the U.S., Canada, because there's no culture of organ donors. And I think that they've done, there's been a very good push in the medical community and so forth about organ donations. And I think that anthropologists could have a similar push to encourage people to consider that when they have died, that their remains shouldn't be buried, but really should be donated to either a forensic anthropology collection or to science, to anatomy classes, or for organ donations, to really change the culture of what we consider with the dead.
Yes.
That would be my dream. And you know, it's kind of funny because one of the things that people will often ask me is like, well, what, you know, and oftentimes they will ask me angrily, but they'll say, well, what if it was your grandmother who was? And, you know, I would have no problem with it. I would have no problem with it if it was my parents. And my parents have, they have put on their will that they want their bodies to go to science or to university lab for anatomy classes. So I think that we need this kind of increase in cultural acceptance of that there is not only one way to respect the dead and to respect people's families, but basically that one of the ways to create respect is to create a culture of acceptance of that once you are dead, that your remains still have use.
Sure.
And we can learn so much from them.
I might even, and I'll take a slight contrarian view on that and still agree with your premise. Let's say, though, it makes it more personal when you use an example and put yourself in your own shoes with it and say, hey, I'd be okay with this with my parents and grandparents. But let's just say for a second the people who at any point were alive while there's people alive now are off limits. That would make it, you know, maybe you have at the highest end of the spectrum, a 200-year or 150, 200-year type gap or something like that. There does need to be a line at some point, though, where you can study things to learn about cultures that, say didn't have an iPhone to store all their data about what went on, right?
Yeah.
So if you're talking about, like you've cited examples today, I think you said the ones in Quebec, you were looking in the 1700s and stuff like
Right.
that. None of those people, none of their family now know who they were. You
Right.
know what I mean? Like there's no personal tie.
Yeah. And I actually think that that's a good point. Like, in a sense, there's a couple things here. One thing is that if there are some examples where there was a clear familial link where repatriation occurred, which I think if it was my family, I wouldn't have done it, but I can understand that. And I think that that's individual differences and, there's still enough of a tie-in. And of course, one of the most famous cases is of the Move bombing. I believe it's Philadelphia Move bombing of 1985, if I'm not wrong, where there was the Black Power
Yes.
Move group, and the government bombed them to try to get them out, kind of like a Waco situation.
Yes.
And
Very similar.
They basically, the university had the remains from the two of the children who had died, right, been killed, and when the family found out that these remains were in the classroom, they wanted the bones back. They wanted the remains back, and I think that and the mother was still alive, right?
Yeah, that's understandable.
And so I can say,
yes.
I probably wouldn't, but I can understand that,
Yes.
and I think that repatriation was the right move. So I think that there are, another example which is a little less recent link, but is still quite a clear link. The great-grandson of Sitting Bull had requested that Sitting Bull's scalp and I believe some artifacts be returned to him as he's the great-grandson. And when this story came out, I was like, he looks just like his great-grandfather. My goodness. He's like, looks so much like him. But he, nevertheless, even though he looks so much like Sitting Bull, he did take a DNA test, and it showed a familial link. And so he got the artifacts in the scalp. I think that that's another good example where there can be these exceptional cases where even though I would maybe make a different decision, I think that it's a clear enough case that there is a familial link with, that you could make those repatriations and not lose too much.
What if you had some sort of parallel world eminent domain situation set up with this? So let me give an example of that, because that's not a perfect parallel. But let's say that for the same one you just said, Sitting Bull's great-grandson, you give back, in this case, the remains are given back, just for the sake of argument here. He stores some of the artifacts in his home, and he buries the remains of his grandfather in his backyard. Obviously, that wouldn't happen, but let's just assume it did. Could there be a situation, though, where we have that set up such that the proven familial relatives of important people from the past do have possession of these things and can determine that, hey, it's going to be here and here based on what we say, but the researchers have some sort of eminent domain to say, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to take a look at this. Maybe we're going to excavate the remains today to test for X, Y, and Z. They are still yours. We are not taking ownership of them. We're not taking them back to a lab for longer than, say, 3 months or something like that, whatever it might be. And they will be returned to your possession when we're finished. Is there a way to have a system like that would make sense?
I actually think there is a way to do a system like that, but in a less complicated way. Basically, there's the repatriation and reburial laws like NAGPRA do not require burial. So the tribes could curate the collections, could keep the collections in their own facilities and allow for access to research. This does happen in some places, and I'm not against that. The only problem is that currently, almost all of the tribes who are active in repatriation do not want to engage in research. They do not want to allow others to engage in research, and any research that is done, they want to be able to control the what questions are asked and what can be published. And so, under these circumstances, that is not doable. It's not feasible. But if you would say, you know what, we get it. We think that repatriation to the tribe, is necessary or is important, and then the tribe would say, well, we understand also that the science is necessary and important. Let's come to a conclusion. We'll curate the facility. Then you can apply for access. But that only works if those people really do want to learn about the past and aren't worried about their oral traditions being challenged. That's where, and so like in certain places, and I think Mexico is one of these places, but also in certain areas of Europe, they'll have area curation facilities that are government run that hold many collections and that you can apply to have access to.
Okay, so there's some potential routes you could go here.
I don't think it will happen in the U.S.
What are I'd asked you a while ago on the podcast about some of the periods that you've studied with Native Americans, but you had said, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the oldest, say, Native American civilizations date back about 9,000 years?
Yes.
Is that right?
So we have Native American remains that are in the Americas. Some of them are reburied already. I think the oldest ones might have been around between 9,000 and 10,000 years. So they're single individuals most of the time. So Kennewick Man is like 8,300 years from Kennewick, Washington, and that he was.
Wait, Washington? That's like kind of north.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whoa.
So one of the suggestions is that they came across, of course, the Bering Land Bridge, but there's also suggestions that they came across on the Kelp Highway. So there's a variety of different routes. I suspect that the Americas was peopled with multiple migrations.
From where?
And from multiple locations.
What places do you think?
I do think that Siberia, so
they came here by boat?
Land and boat. So I do think that both, I think, just travel generations and generations, right? So, and also, of course, if they're going from Siberia to Alaska, when the Bering Strait was a Bering Bridge, right? So, and then this feeds into, when was the Americas peopled? And that can be a little tricky. There's some evidence that suggests it was very early, like maybe even as early as 25,000 years old. Some say it's much later, like 14,000. And depending on which route you accept will shape the time period too. I really do think that it's actually multiple migrations. There's no reason why there would only be one migration. Once you get going, other people are going to follow you. Right?
Yes, I think that makes sense.
So, and one of the things we see in these Paleo-Indians, so once again, 7,500 years old and older, is that they don't look like each other. They don't always look like modern Native Americans. So, for example, Lucia, who is in Brazil, who's, I think, about 12,000 years old, she looked very much like, more like Australian Aborigine. And her skeletal features or her skull whereas Spirit Cave, which was in Nevada, about 10,000 years, between 8,500 and 10,000. The timing differs sometimes depending on what method's used, but looks much more like what we'd expect a Native American to look like. So there's kind of, they look different from each other. Some of them look different from the present day Native Americans or the after 5,000 years, let's say. And so this really does suggest multiple migrations and replacement.
What was the concept with younger Dryas? I think we talked about this with Matt, but we talked about it with someone else too, where they were saying that the ice sheet covered all of Canada and enough all the way down to at least New York in the U.S.
Yeah.
And then how long ago did they say it would have been inhabitable? Because I'm going to ask you about this, obviously, but I wanted to see if you remembered this, Les.
Oh.
No worries if you don't.
Yeah, I don't.
Basically, the argument was, and Matt LaCroix was definitely one of the people who talked about this, but the argument was because of the younger Dryas and because of that ice sheet, there couldn't have been ancient civilizations in the United States. It would have been uninhabitable, say, like above Texas or something like that. So if Younger Dryas was approximately 11,600 years ago, when you sit here and tell me that you're finding some of these skeletons in like Washington 8,500 to 10,000 years ago, or Nevada, something like that, I'm wondering how it was even inhabitable at that point.
The Ice Age ends at around 10,000 years.
Like ends, but that's where I get confused.
Yeah.
Is that abrupt?
It's not abrupt, but certain areas were less covered with ice than others. So the coast, for example, was not covered with ice. So that's one of the reasons why they think that they can follow down the Kelp Highway. And
where is that?
The Kelp Highway is basically a concept that that Americas was peopled by boat, following along areas where kelp grows.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.